Yo bar, what's up and what's happening? And welcome back to it's the Yo Bar series with me, Chris Harding. In today's episode, we're going to be looking into the fourth installation of the Diabetes Transformation course. Before we get started, I'd like to thank you all for tuning in. Please like and subscribe to the channel and also comment on the video below. Okay, play the intro. In the previous episode, in episode 3, we looked at diabetes from an anthropological point of view, or an anthropological perspective, if you like. Basically, we looked at diabetes in 21st century society and why we are suffering with this kind of modern day disease. So now that we've given diabetes a little bit of a history lesson, we've given it a background or a story, what we want to do now is look at the actual present day problem, okay? So the present day problem is basically going to start with the thing that governs energy. And for us as humans, the thing that governs energy is something called the metabolism. And you'll hear the metabolism described in many different ways, and I'm sure none of them are incorrect. But the way that I like to think of the metabolism is that it's your little engine, okay? It's a thing that generates things to keep going. It's going to be responsible for cell production, and in a lot of ways, cell production is actually going to be responsible for how the metabolism responds. So inside every single cell that you have in your body, inside that is something called a mitochondria. And inside the mitochondria is basically an energy source, but it's also a bit like a motherboard like you find on a computer. So the mitochondria, you have this tiny energy source, and every single cell has mitochondria inside it. But basically, if we start to look at how we're feeding ourselves and the types of food that we choose to eat and the activities that we start to do, we're going to affect those cells. And by us affecting those cells, it's going to affect the metabolism. So in the by and large, or the sum total, your metabolism is an expression of what your cells do on a daily basis, their activity, your cellular activity. And each division of cells, so we say, all have a different role or responsibility to do within your body. So these cells, what are they doing? Well, they're busy doing lots of different things, such as producing certain types of hormones to regulate the body, reproduction, so cellular breakdown and reconstruction. That happens on a daily, regular basis. Every moment that you live and breathe, your body's constantly breaking down and rebuilding again. One obviously major function of the body, or from the metabolism's point of view, is that your brain is obviously taking a huge amount of energy. So your brain takes up 25% of your calories per day. And so things such as looking after one's metabolism is an extremely important reason to understand, so that we can understand diabetes. What we need to think about is, or what we need to consider, is that the metabolism is constantly playing back and forth, or a tug of war, if you like. What I mean by that is, if we can think of a balance and an imbalance, or positive and negative, there are constant positives and there are constant negatives inside not only our lifestyle, but within inside our body. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's take an average day. So you wake up by an alarm. When you wake up by an alarm, it's not a natural way to wake up. Therefore, it basically means that you've had to wake up. So therefore, that's a small form of stress. Well, that's something that your body has to endure. When you go to work, you were driving in your car, let's say, there could be traffic, that's a form of stress. You might have social stress or peer pressure when you go to work or when you go to school or whatever you do in your day-to-day lives. Then you have lots of different things such as physical stress. So there could be physical exertion. You might have a manual job, or you might train hard, or you might go to the gym. They're not necessarily negative things. They can also be looked at as positive things, but they are forms of stress. And then you have to look at the other side of it and say, well, on the flip side, you have things such as rest. Okay, now there can be people who have too much rest, and there can be people who don't have enough rest. And what you start to see that there are balances all the way throughout life. There are balances in our diet, there are balances in our lifestyle, and there are also balances in our habitual use as well. So things that are habits for us as individuals, there are also balances and imbalances for that. And all of those things have a wide effect on the metabolism. The metabolism's constantly adjusting to try and find where it needs to be, what energy needs to be pulled, what energy needs to be used, and where the cells are going to be used the highest. So for me, doing this YouTube video and doing the research before I record this video for you, my brain is whirring, at quite a high rate, because I'm trying to think about what I want to say to you and how I want to put it across. So obviously, my brain is using a huge amount of energy, and my metabolism is responsible for lending me that energy so that I can do this video for you. So, what breaks down cells? Let's give you a really simple example. Exercise, or quite vigorous exercise, will break down muscle cells, okay? So when you exercise, there's a breakdown of muscle cells, which is basically what I would call a pull. And then to give back, the body then regenerates those muscle cells, and they grow stronger. So the body is constantly trying to adjust cellular structure, breakdown and rebuild. Another good example, and one that you may actually relate to, is dieting or harsh dieting. Okay, so one thing that can really affect the metabolism, and I will get onto this a little bit later on in this video. So when you diet, if you yo-yo diet or you fast for long periods of time, such as intermittent fasting, where people do these things such as 1 meal a day, where they only have 1 meal per day, they are forms of stress. They put a lot of stress on the body. Now, there's going to be an adjustment there to say there's a good thing coming from that, and there's also a bad thing coming from that. But what I'm trying to build a picture in your mind is the metabolism is constantly adjusting because of the cellular production and deconstruction of produce, so what it's trying to produce for that day. Another way to look at it is the fact that if you rest for too long, so if you sit in front of the television all day and you don't do anything, you're also going to crash your metabolism in a way where you're not going to keep your metabolism up for a reason. So if you're not pushing your body to do something, and if you're not pushing your brain and your mind to do something, then what's going to happen is that the need to have a high functioning metabolism is always going to be another form of that sort of mechanical breakdown, if you can imagine that if you don't run the engine will actually get worse. It's a bit like a car. If you leave a car on your driveway for too long, the car will start to break down. It needs to be run for it to work properly. Exactly the same for the metabolism. So on one hand, you've got these kind of very extreme performances that your body can do, and you've also then got these very lazy sort of non-performances that your body can do or can't do or isn't doing. And our metabolism is right in the middle of that. It's basically trying to negate between the things that we choose to do and the things that we choose not to do. So let's look at cellular production on a very basic level. Let's look at it as on a macro level rather than a micro level. Your cells are basically going to be governed, and they are also governing your metabolism. I'm going to leave your activity to one side, and I'm going to focus just on what you're going to choose to eat. So you have this thing called the gut microbiome, and that pretty much is in charge of quite a lot of things. And I'm not going to delve into that too deeply. If you want to, you can delve into that with me, and I'll link the video up here. But your gut microbiome is very much dependent on what you choose to do with it. So again, that goes back to the environment that you live in. So if you live in a very busy city with lots of fumes and lots of chemicals in the air, then that's going to have an effect on the gut microbiome. Also, if you choose to eat or consume highly processed foods, that's going to have an effect on your gut biome. If you choose to live a very stressful life, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you have because some people have stressful jobs, but they cope with them well because they find other avenues to de-stress. But other things that can lead to stress is things such as socializing and having too much of a social life, okay? And alcohol and other things that come into that can also have a stress on the body. They will also have a stress, they will dampen down your gut microbiome. So when we're looking at diet for diabetes, we want to consider the things that we are going to eat. Everything that you choose to eat, whether you like it or not, is actually going to have an effect on your gut microbiome. And I'm not picking on diets here, but one thing I will say is the fact that there are two very popular types of diet / lifestyle eating, and they are the keto diet and the intermittent fasting diet. And I love both of these. Before I get started, I love both of these diets. But I think, like everything, they can get to the point where they become an extreme, okay? People are taking the keto diet to the point where they're ingesting foods that are full of toxins just because they don't have any carbohydrate in them. So in a nutshell, the keto diet is basically trying to avoid carbohydrates, and fats and protein are the winners, the macro winners. By doing this, obviously, there is an opportunity for food companies to produce foods that have got zero carbohydrate in them or zero sugars, but then they have to put additives in that for the product to taste good, or they put huge amounts of saturated fat or huge amounts of salt. And that wouldn't be found in our diet. I've got nothing against fat, saturated fat, or salt. More of it than there is needed or naturally found. Why would we consume it? Because it's not going to do any favors for the gut microbiome. Therefore, it's not going to do any favors for the metabolism. And therefore, after that, if your metabolism hasn't got any favors because of the way that you're eating, it's not going to do your diabetes any good. So, apart from the sugar levels and blood sugar levels, one of these things that comes into it is the metabolism and the way that the metabolism is treated and the types of stress that we give the metabolism. Obviously, I touched there briefly on intermittent fasting as well, and kind of the same thing. Intermittent fasting works really well, and it's a really good way to control your intake of food. If you're someone who's overweight or someone who's diabetic, intermittent fasting definitely can play a very important role in controlling someone's metabolism, their blood glucose, and also, their diet in general. However, I feel that the IF diet can go to the extreme where people are almost trying to not eat for days and days on end. Now, will you lose weight? Yes, of course, because you're not eating. And you are trying to stay hydrated, but you can't keep dampening down your metabolism. You have to feed the body so that the cells can rejuvenate enough and break down and rebuild, and that's what the metabolism's for, and that's why we feed the body. Yes, should we feed it in a period of time? If it works for you, that's fantastic. And would you like to do all of your eating in one sitting where you have all of your nutrients and all of your calories and all of your energy in one sitting rather than doing it on an 8 or 10 hour period? Yeah, that's fine. But can you get all of your nutrients, all of your macros, all of your calories in one meal? If you can't do this, then what I would suggest is, or what I would recommend is, can you get at least the calories and the macros and the nutrients that you need in possibly 2 meals split throughout the day and still keep within your intermittent fasting window? So to sum up those two diets and also other diets that people want to experiment with, by dropping a whole macronutrient, which in this case is carbohydrate, and replacing it with additives is no good for you. It's not going to do your microbiome any good. It's not going to do your metabolism any good. And by starving the body for long periods of time, extended periods of time, also isn't going to do the metabolism any good, which also isn't going to do your diabetes any good, because it's suppressing rather than suppressing and then rebuilding again. And I'll give you a really good example of this, and I will actually write down the example of where I heard this because it's on someone else's YouTube channel. But there was an explanation as to why starvation can be quite dangerous. When they took some Jews that had survived the World War II and they took them out of the camps, they basically tried to refeed them. And some of these people had almost immediate heart attacks and strokes. And the reason that is because people who had been suffering from starvation due to the fact that they were being imprisoned meant that when they tried to refeed them, they were given obviously like a very basic food such as porridge and bread and things like this, which break down into glycogen or sugar inside the body. And then what would happen is that when the body would try to absorb the sugar or the glycogen into the muscle cells would then push back out sodium, which would basically make the blood thicker. By thickening the blood, it would give them an immediate heart attack or stroke. And so unfortunately, when the system had been suppressed so much, the body actually wasn't used to having that type of macronutrient in it in an immediacy. So when they re-ate or tried to refeed these people, their heart was already under a lot of stress, and therefore with a huge amount of glycogen going into the body, which the body just wasn't prepared for or used to, and then this high amount of sodium pushing back out of the muscle tissue back into the blood cell would thicken the blood, and these people would die from it. What I'm trying to say is that starvation, as an example, isn't the best way to lose overall weight. You will lose overall weight, but it's not necessarily going to be the weight that you want it to be, and it's not necessarily going to be a good thing for your diabetes, because if you do starve too much, your body will then start to break down muscle tissue, and by it breaking down muscle tissue, which is called glyconeogenesis, it basically turns muscle tissue back into sugar, turns it back into glycogen, which then ups your blood sugar again, and the cycle continues on and on and on. So, and that is especially for diabetics, by the way. So it's very important to understand that your balances, like we talked about at the beginning of this video, your balances are something that you have to look after. You have to look after your lifestyle, you have to look after your exercise, you have to look after your nutrition. And within your nutrition, the diets that you choose to do have to be looked after as well. You can't abuse a diet just because you want to lose weight. As I've said before in previous videos, it's your decision to get to the point where you're overweight. And so therefore, that's had to have taken some time. And if it's taken time to put weight on, it's going to take time to take weight off. So when we are looking at diabetes, we're looking at a few different things. And one of the things we're going to need to consider is the way in which your body produces insulin. Now, if you're type 1 diabetic, unfortunately your pancreas doesn't really create insulin that well, if at all. So people who suffer with type 1 diabetes have to have injections of insulin to be able to control their blood glucose and how their body uses macronutrients and nutrients and micronutrients and everything of that nature. For people who have type 2 diabetes, basically type 2 diabetes is more like a blood disorder where there is insulin present, but there's so much sugar or glucose going into the body at any given time when the person decides to eat that the insulin just isn't being recognized. The pancreas is still pumping out insulin, but the body just isn't recognizing it anymore. So why is exercise such a good thing for us when it comes to diabetes? Well, when we exercise, basically our body gets hungry because we're burning up energy. If we or our cells are burning up energy, then we are going to need to increase the need for energy, which is basically an increase in our metabolism. Therefore, if there's going to be an increase in our metabolism, the food or the energy that we are going to need to consume is going to up the need for insulin, which is the hormone which drives the nutrients or the macros into the muscle cells to continue to be used. So if you can imagine someone just very simply running, they're burning up glycogen, which is sugar, and insulin is then giving more glycogen from stores and also from the food that has been consumed that day to the muscle tissue. So when we exercise, we actually improve the way in which we provide our cells with insulin. By doing this, we're making ourselves a lot more sensitive to insulin, which is a very positive thing. The more sensitive we can be to insulin, then the less chances we have of being diabetic, because the body's starting to pick up the fact that insulin's there. Whereas previously with type 2 diabetes, the body isn't picking up insulin hardly at all. And that's why we're having to use medication, we're having to use specific diets. But one thing that we can use, which is kind of pretty much free to everybody, is a form of exercise. And a form of exercise, just from a fitness trainer's point of view, is that if you can just at least up your heart rate once a day to a point where you're getting out of breath, even if it's for 10 to 15 minutes, that is actually going to help you start to increase your sensitivity to insulin, which is a natural thing. And the more that your body is sensitive to insulin, the more your body is going to start to regenerate the process and begin the natural sort of regoverning of using insulin in the right way, using blood glucose in the correct way, and also starting to demand for better foods. And with that understanding that you know that you need to feed your gut, your body, with the right types of foods rather than having highly processed foods, it all comes around full circle. Everything starts to work again. The little engine is firing on all cylinders. Now, we have briefly touched on this on the previous video and possibly the video before that with sleep and managing stress. And I have touched on those things very lightly in this video as well. But what I'll say about sleep is that you really need to be getting some quality sleep. If you're someone who is not getting quality sleep for whatever reason, then that is definitely something that you need to address. If you've got type 2 diabetes and you're not getting the sleep that you need, and the minimum really you should be getting is around about 6 hours, but if you're not getting some form of quality REM, which is rapid eye movement, and NREM, which is non-rapid eye movement, then you're not going to be able to repair. Your system isn't going to be able to come back to a sort of a baseline level, so that when you wake up the next day, you're sort of starting from fresh. And also the fact that if you're someone who's either easily stressed, or you're not managing your stress levels, or you're in a stressful environment such as a job or such as a social circumstance, or possibly even a circumstance which is close to home, it is important to try your best to try and find ways and to manage your stress, because otherwise it's going to have a negative impact on your type 2 diabetes and also your type 1 diabetes. So to sum up again, the 21st century lifestyle is something that can really affect our diabetes, and if we don't manage that properly, then there's no chance that we're actually going to be able to manage our diabetes without using a form of a pill, or possibly worse, even relying on a manufactured hormone such as insulin. So if you enjoyed this video, then please rewatch it again, just so that you've got down the basic instruments that you need to be able to use so that you can start to reverse your type 2 diabetes and, if possible, improve your type 1 diabetes. So in the next lesson, you're going to learn how our metabolism manages your blood sugar levels and how that can either greatly or negatively affect your diabetes. Manage your metabolism and your gut microbiome. Stay fit, stay healthy, and of course, be a boss, bro.